In the year 2000, the world of rock music was, well, it was kind of weird and different. Nu metal had a chokehold on radio, pop punk was all over the charts, and that raw, unpredictable danger that made rock feel so important, it felt like a distant memory. But out of the desert border city of El Paso, Texas, a completely different sound was crawling from the wreckage. It was chaotic, it was smart, and it was so full of energy, it was breathtaking. This wasn't just a band, it was a force of nature, and they were about to change everything. In 2000, one band from El Paso, Texas seemed poised to save rock and roll itself. Their album Relationship of Command was a masterpiece. Critics couldn't stop talking about it, and their live shows were pure legendary chaos. Some were even calling them the next Nirvana. Then, right at the peak of their power, they were gone. Because you guys requested it, this is the story of how At the Drive-In burned brighter and faster than anyone else and why they had to completely disappear just to survive. Punk's origins stretch back to the garage rock and experimental chaos of the mid to late 60s. Rebellious American garage bands, think the Sonics and the Seeds, built a sound distinguished by raw simplicity, sneering vocals, and a driving rhythm. Acts like Detroit's MC5 and the Stooges pioneered proto-punk, stripping away the excess of mainstream rock and laying the groundwork for punk's confrontational stance and sonic minimalism. They made it okay to be, well, different. During the mid to late 70s, punk became a worldwide phenomenon. In New York, bands like Ramones, Television, and the Patti Smith Group played blistering, concise songs fueled by anger and alienation. Johnny Thunders and the New York Dolls fused glam, grit, and chaos, inspiring a visual and musical style centered on both rebellion and vulnerability. Simultaneously, the UK erupted with the likes of Sex Pistols, The Clash, and The Damned, turning punk into a cultural revolution. Punk was about more than music. It was a movement, defined by DIY ethics, DIY fashion, and the rejection of corporate rock's bloated excess. By the 80s, punk split into subgenres, most notably hardcore bands like Black Flag, Minor Threat, and Bad Brains, who ramped up the speed and aggression. Others branched into anarcho-punk and regional styles, and with the rise of post-punk and new wave, artists explored more experimental, atmospheric sounds, broadening punk's scope. Hardcore's immense energy and refusal to compromise became a blueprint for underground music scenes in America and abroad. The late 80s and 90s saw the birth of post-hardcore, a genre that retained punk's urgency but embraced complexity in structure, emotion, and experimentation. Bands such as Fugazi pushed punk beyond aggression, incorporating diverse influences and social consciousness while maintaining DIY principles. The underground scene flourished and the sound diversified, giving us groups like At the Drive-In. The band hailed from El Paso, Texas. It's a city on the edge, a cultural crossroads cut off by endless desert, a place that had to invent its own identity because it had no other choice. It was in this pressure cooker that guitarist Jim Ward and singer Cedric Bixler-Zavala started At the Drive-In in 1994 after meeting in high school, pouring all of that punk energy and artistic isolation into their music. The pair were bored of their hometown. After pressing their first EP, El Paso, they did a 25-city tour with a revolving lineup of musicians in the subsequent years. Their start was anything but glamorous. They were all about that do-it-yourself ethic, because if you were a band trying to get noticed from a place that was far off the music industry map, you really had no other choice. Their first show happened at a local spot called The Attic, and another one was at a high school fair. It wasn't pretty, but it was real. They'd start their days early, practicing for hours on end, sometimes rehearsing for up to 9 hours straight. Whenever they recorded new music, they mailed their singles and demos to independent punk labels like Discord and Fat Records, determined to catch someone's attention and maybe land a record deal. The band members were also known for building their own gear cases, so much so that other bands even teased them, assuming their setup looked too professional to be DIY. Eventually, the group signed with local label Flipside, but they did not fully understand the contract, which came back to bite them later on. Their early sound was just raw, unpolished energy. It was a chaotic blend of punk, emo, and the beginnings of what we now call post-hardcore, taking cues from underground giants like Fugazi and Drive like Jehu. But even on those first recordings, you could hear something special starting to form. A mix of aggression and weirdly beautiful melodies that made them stand out. That vision really started to lock in with their first full-length album in 1996, Acrobatic Tenement. The story behind it is legendary. They made the entire record for just $600, which shows just how resourceful and dedicated they were. The production might have been thin, but the ideas and raw power were massive. It was a huge step up and set up the stage for everything that came next, but it almost never happened. After finishing finishing the record, At the Drive-In actually broke up before it was even released. They had problems within the band, including a serious disagreement between Jim and Omar, which led to several lineup changes. Eventually, Tony Hajjar and Paul Hinojos joined the group. Omar, who had originally played bass on the album, switched to guitar for live shows, so the band's lineup and their live performances ended up being quite different from how they sounded on their first album. As for their record label Flipside, At the Drive-In had to negotiate and pay their way out of that agreement, eventually moving on to the slightly bigger label Fearless Records, where they were able to release 2 full-length albums. Soon the classic lineup finally fell into place, with Cedric Bixler fronting the group, guitarist Omar Rodríguez-López and Jim Ward, bassist Paul Hinojos, and drummer Tony Hajjar. This wasn't just a lineup change, it was a chemical reaction. The way that Ward and Rodríguez-López's guitars played off each other became their signature. One was rooted in punk rock and the other was flying off into wild, unpredictable places. With a beast of a rhythm section holding it down, At the Drive-In was ready to break out of the Texas underground and take on the world. They had survived the desert, perfected their craft on the road, and were about to set a fire that would change rock music forever. The years between 1997 and 2000 were just an insane creative explosion for the group. At the Drive-In released their third EP in 1997, which saw them get more melodic but still keeping that abrasive edge. But it was their 1998 album In Casino Out that was their real arrival. They decided to record the whole thing live in the studio to capture the wild kinetic energy of their shows. That decision was everything. It was like they bottled lightning, the sudden changes in rhythm, the tangled guitar work, and the pure emotional release. The album was a masterpiece of controlled chaos. The songs like Napoleon Solo showed a new level of sophistication, balancing the noise with these hauntingly beautiful moments. In Casino Out became a classic of the late 90s post-hardcore, getting them rave reviews and a loyal fan base. If In Casino Out was the breakthrough, then their 1999 EP Via was the bridge to their masterpiece. And it's really where the band started to get weird, playing with strange time signatures and surreal lyrics that pointed toward the progressive sounds some of them were dying to explore. It was the last big jump before they hit perfection. As At the Drive-In developed a devoted following, they started getting big-time admirers like Thurston Moore from Sonic Youth. Their rising profile soon drew the interest of Beastie Boys label Grand Royal. Grand Royal at the time had merged with Dent Records, who was headed by Gary Gersh, who had signed Nirvana years earlier. The band got signed to Grand Royal after Gersh saw the band share a festival bill with Sonic Youth. It was Thurston Moore who brought the band to Gersh's attention. Gersh told Spin that the band had the potential to be one of the biggest groups in the world. At the Drive-In also came to the attention of producer Ross Robinson, best known for working with heavier acts like Korn, Limp Bizkit, and Slipknot. They soon realized that his working style was a lot different than your typical heavy music producer. He acted as a sort of therapist to the band and pushed them to their limits. At one point, Robinson supposedly drove bassist Paul Hinojos around the Malibu hills in an SUV just to get his adrenaline jack before a take. When recording the song Invalid Litter Department, which addresses the unresolved disappearances of women in Juarez along the Mexican border, Robinson asked the band to envision the kick drum as the pulsing beat of every missing mother in the world. While his methods could seem a little bit weird, they ultimately helped the band tap into a deeper sense of expression. Rodriguez explained that the emotional exercises their producer put them through in the studio really resonated with him, drawing on methods he'd actually learned during therapy and personal healing. But he claimed he had never applied these techniques to music before. Though he wouldn't typically discuss his past so openly when making a record, he now recognized he can use his experiences as a creative tool. For Bixler, recording with such emotional intensity meant revisiting the loss of 2 close friends from El Paso who died in a car accident. The group's drummer, Hajjar, told Rolling Stone, "I haven't talked about this, but in the song Ross brought up my mom. She passed away in 1988, and it was a poignant time. I don't know if I should have gone that far when we were recording. Now every time we play it, I associate the song with my emotions about her." And this all leads us to what many consider to be their masterpiece, 2000's Relationship of Command. The band's third album drew heavily from the raw intensity of Washington, D.C. pioneers like Fugazi and Bad Brains. From the explosive first notes of Rock Arsenal, the album is just a freight train. The lead single, One Armed Scissor, became an instant anthem. It got tons of radio play, and suddenly, a band that had been grinding it out in a van was playing on The Late Show with David Letterman and later with Jools Holland. Their performance on Jools Holland is now legendary. It's a blur of flying hair, microphone acrobatics, and pure chaos that was broadcast straight into living rooms across the UK. The song peaked at number 26 on the alternative chart in America and number 64 in the UK. Relationship of Command is a landmark album. It smashed punk fury together with art rock ambition, with cryptic lyrics about everything from the femicides in Juarez on Invalid Litter Department to conformity on Pattern Against User. Critics called it a masterpiece, and it's now seen as one of the most important post-hardcore records ever made. It wasn't just a great album, it was a statement. In a time of polished cookie-cutter rock, At the Drive-In was raw, unpredictable, and a breath of fresh air. They had hit the absolute peak of their power, standing right on the edge of mainstream stardom, being called the saviors of rock and roll. Even their peers recognized the genius of these guys.
And changed my my faith in rock and roll again. That band was called At the Drive-In.
In a September 2000 issue of the influential music magazine Billboard, Kristen Welsh, who was the head of marketing for Grand Royal, boldly claimed, "This band can save rock." This statement certainly turned heads, especially considering that from an industry perspective, rock music in the US was actually thriving at the time. Major acts like Rage Against the Machine, Nine Inch Nails, Limp Bizkit, Korn, and Creed had all recently topped the Billboard 200 chart, and Ozfest, created by Sharon and Ozzy Osbourne, had quickly become one of the year's biggest stories. Omar shared his feelings about all the hype telling louder sound. They threw a bunch of ridiculous hype at us that just didn't fit. You can't label some kids from El Paso as the next Nirvana. That wasn't who we are. And then everything just fell apart. At the start of 2001, At the Drive-In should have been on top of the world. Relationship of Command was a huge success. Their live shows were the stuff of legend, and they were staring down a level of fame that most underground bands could only dream of. But behind the curtain, the same fire that made their music so incredible was burning them to the ground. In March of 2001, at the absolute height of it all, the band announced they were taking an indefinite hiatus. To the world, it was a total shock. For the band, it was about survival. On the night of February 21st, 2001, while At the Drive-In was performing in the Netherlands, guitarist Omar Rodríguez-López walked off partway through a song. He reflected, "I was just so mad, and I just didn't want to be there. I felt like I cheated myself somehow. I felt that it was my own corruption staring back at me that put me in this situation." Rodríguez-López was found by his bandmates crying in the dressing room after the show. The members had previously made a pact that if the pressure got to be too much, they would take a 6-month hiatus. It seemed like the band were going to take that break. But a few weeks later, the band's management notified Omar and Cedric that the other members had reconsidered. Breaking from their initial agreement, those bandmates voted against the hiatus and committed to an extensive run of new dates, including a headlining US tour, European festivals, multiple Canadian shows, and dates in both Mexico and Japan. They spanned from March right through September. Understandably, Omar and Cedric were furious at this abrupt change of plans, with both of them opting to quit the group and start a new venture. That new venture they ended up starting was the Mars Volta. Ward himself didn't hold back, telling them that he looked forward to seeing them fail and was sure it wouldn't be long before they'd return asking to rejoin. Now, the reasons for the band's split were complicated. The biggest one was just pure exhaustion. All those years of nonstop touring had taken a massive physical and mental toll. They were a band that ran on pure kinetic energy, and after years of leaving it all on the stage every single night, there was nothing left to give. Cedric later said he felt creatively suffocated. Omar and Cedric openly voiced their discomfort with the macho attitudes and sexism present on the rock circuit, as well as with the aggressive behavior of some of their fans. They concluded that bigger crowds can sometimes mean less thoughtful listeners. But it wasn't just exhaustion, as drugs also played a role as well. Huge creative divide had also been growing in the band for a while. It had basically split the group into two camps. On one side, you had Cedric and Omar, who were getting pulled toward more weirder, more progressive and psychedelic sounds, the stuff they'd already started touching on. On the other side were Jim, Paul, and Tony, who wanted to stick with the more straightforward melodic post-hardcore that had been the band's foundation. These weren't just friendly disagreements about music, they were deep fundamental differences in what they wanted to be as artists. Cedric and Omar felt like they had to escape At the Drive-In to keep growing. The success and all the expectations that came with it felt like a cage. They wanted a new playground, one where they could get experimental without being tied to what everyone thought At the Drive-In should be. The result was two brand new bands that perfectly represented two halves of At the Drive-In's personality. Cedric and Omar formed the Mars Volta, a wildly ambitious progressive rock band that took At the Drive-In's stranger tendencies and shot them into space. Their music was complex, sprawling, and demanding. Meanwhile, the rest of the band formed Sparta. Their sound was a direct continuation of the powerful, melodic, and anthem-driven rock that had always been Ward's specialty. Sparta was powerful and full of heart, carrying the torch for their sound that made their old band so loved. When At the Drive-In vanished, they left a huge hole in the rock world. They were a supernova that lit up the sky, only to collapse under their own massive gravity. The split wasn't just a band breaking up, it was the end of what felt like a promise. But even though the band was gone, the shockwaves of what they created were just getting started. For more than 10 years, the legacy of At the Drive-In lived on in two separate pieces: the far-out prog journeys of the Mars Volta and the grounded rock of Sparta. A reunion seemed impossible, but then in 2012 it happened. At the Drive-In got back together to play huge festivals like Coachella and Lollapalooza. For fans who never got to see them live the first time around, it was a dream come true. But the reunion didn't last long and the reviews were, well, mixed. Some felt the shows were missing that chaotic spark and that the band was just going through the motions. They gave it another more serious shot in 2016. The band announced they were actually writing and recording new music for the first time in over 15 years. But there was also a big change. Guitarist Jim Ward was out, replaced by Sparta's Keely Davis. 2017 they released their fourth album, and the album was a clear attempt to get back to their signature sound, a storm of jagged riffs, complex rhythms, and frantic vocals, just with modern production. It was a strong record that proved they could still tap into the energy, even if it felt like it didn't quite capture the lightning in a bottle magic of their earlier works. The band toured hard for their new album, but by November of 2018, it was over again. After a final show in Brazil, they announced another indefinite hiatus. More recently, in a response to a fan online, Bixler seemed to close the door for good, stating that the chapter was permanently sealed forever. At the Drive-In was officially history, but you can't erase their impact. Relationship of Command is still the gold standard that other post-hardcore albums are judged against. They breathed new life into a whole genre, bringing a level of art, intelligence, and pure ferocity that had been missing. You can hear their DNA in so many bands that came after them. They proved that a band from a forgotten city, fueled by nothing but passion and a DIY attitude, could completely rewrite the rules of rock music. The story of At the Drive-In is a perfect rock and roll tragedy. A gritty start, a sky-high rise to the top of their game, and a sudden dramatic exit that sealed their legendary status. They were a band so intense they had to break up to save themselves. They vanished at the height of their powers, but they left behind a flawless legacy and a collection of songs that still sound as urgent, important, and dangerous as the day they were recorded. That brings us to the end of today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again on Rock and Roll True Stories. Take care.